Hey folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board. Tonight, the 4 steps to victory. So, in my last video, I talked a little bit about conflict and why it's important to stories. And tonight, I want to talk a little bit about conflict and how you sort it out. Because I think a lot of people, they either have how they want the end of their major conflict to play out, which is fine, or they just sort of wing it. And I guess there's nothing inherently wrong with just letting your characters bounce off of each other and coming up with whatever you feel the logical outcome to that should be. But I think that a lot of the time that comes out in pretty much the same way. And one of the best examples of this, I actually think, is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. All of those movies resolve their conflicts in pretty much the same way. The heroes and the villains show up in one place and they feed each other around a little bit until the villain makes a mistake or the hero has a revelation, and then they're done. And, I guess that's okay the first couple of times, but it's not super interesting. I mean, there's a lot of good spectacle. There's maybe a little drama in how the supporting characters play out. There's a lot of spectacle, a lot of action, a lot of special effects, and that's not necessarily bad. But it gets kind of old, and I was really pleasantly surprised with the ending of Doctor Strange, because at the end of Doctor Strange, Doctor Strange, he doesn't actually fight Dormammu. He outwits him. He uses his head, and I like that. Even though a lot of that movie, there's nothing outside the normal formula to the movie, other than some really trippy special effects that I personally was a big fan of. But other than that, there wasn't a whole lot to be remarked on in Doctor Strange. But I thought the fact that he used his head in that final fight was good, and it made it different. It made it stand out. And I think it made a lot of sense because Dormammu is a cosmic force. You can't really beat him down, and B, it fit Doctor Strange's personality. And I would really like to see more of that in the MCU. I'm not holding my breath. That's just not the way they seem to put their movies together. It is much more about heart than it is about head, which it's worked pretty well for them so far. We'll see how much longer they can keep that up. But personally, I think it's important to dig a little deeper into conflict resolution. And so I have a process of thinking about conflicts and how they're going to play out, which I call the 4 steps to victory. And you're probably wondering, what are these 4 steps? Well, they are strategy, tactics, techniques, and power. And in your typical Marvel movie, all conflict plays out at the level of techniques and power. Who has more tricks up their sleeve? Who has more raw power behind them? In the case of characters like Hulk or Thor, this is really where conflicts are resolved. But the important thing about 4 Steps to Victory, which is kind of a derivative of stuff you will find in The Art of War or other books like that, is that if somebody is ahead of you on a higher step, you can be ahead of them on lower steps. It doesn't matter. So if somebody beats you at strategy, it doesn't matter how good your techniques are. You're going to lose. And so you have to think about each one of these steps and line them up. Your hero has to equal your villain in strategy and in tactics if he's going to beat them in technique, or has to equal them in all 3 in order to beat them in power. On the other hand, a really crafty character can win at the level of strategy or tactics. You see that a lot in movies like Ocean's 11, where the heist is so many steps ahead of the people being ripped off that it just doesn't matter how the people being robbed try to stop the thieves. So what are each of these steps? I guess before we go any farther, we should talk about them in a little more detail. And then I think I'm going to do a video, not my next 4 videos, but I am going to do a video on each step over time. And so the 4 steps are strategy. Strategy is determining what you want. How you're going, not how you're going to get it, but what you want and why it's important. So let's take the example of, let's use a historical example, which hopefully people are familiar with. Let's take the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, in the Battle of Gettysburg, the strategy on each side was pretty simple. Robert E. Lee and the Confederates wanted to try and capture Washington, D.C., so they could make the Union sue for peace, and they could go their own way and be an independent nation. And on the other side, the Union soldiers and General, who was it? Was it Madison? It wasn't McClellan. The Union commander had to keep them from getting to Washington, D.C. So, pretty simple strategic goal. That dictated the tactics. Robert E. Lee had to go north. He had to advance. He had to capture provisions. He, in general, had to get closer to Washington, D.C. He had to keep his army around, because if the army of Northern Virginia was destroyed, well, the South couldn't field another army. The army of Northern Virginia was all they had. On the other hand, on the Union side of things, they couldn't run away. They couldn't maneuver. They couldn't really advance. They had to make sure they stayed between the Confederates and D.C. So that's tactics. And then techniques. Well, once they actually met at Gettysburg, the Union troops dug in. They tried to build artillery emplacements. They took the high ground, all this other stuff. And then, the Confederates, they're trying to outflank. They're making cavalry charges, pickets charge. You can really start to dig into that stuff. But all that stuff is techniques. That's, how they were going about on a minute-by-minute basis getting to their strategic goals. As opposed to their tactics, which were, the day-by-day, each step is you zoom in another layer. And then finally, power was, how many guns they had, how much artillery they had, what unit morale was, and how quickly they maneuvered to get into position. That was their power. So you have to have an understanding of each of those 4 things for your characters, for your protagonist, for your antagonists, in order to really do a good job resolving their conflict in a way that is, more creative than just 2 people hitting each other. Now, 2 people hitting each other is fine. You can definitely do a story like that. Look at the fight between All Might and All for One in My Hero Academia, if you want to see a really great conflict that is resolved strictly through power. There's a lot of aspects of each of their power in there. Their morale, their ideals, and of course, All Might actually wins that fight on technique, but that's neither here nor there. It does add, an interesting layer of depth to that story, though, I think. So, yeah, having a grasp on what your characters want, what their strategy is, how they're trying to go about getting it. Are they looking for a straight up conflict? Are they looking to be tricky? Are they better suited, avoiding conflict altogether? What are their principles, and how will those affect the way they try conflict resolution? All of those things are very important. And I think that a lot of the times when people are looking to resolve their conflict, they have the climax in mind and they just work backwards from there, and they don't necessarily think, how does this line up with people's strategy, with people's techniques, with their individual strength or power. Another very recent example of this is Game of Thrones. Now, I don't watch Game of Thrones, but I understand that at the end of the last episode, they just had a conclusion in mind. They wanted one character to kill the chief villain, and they just worked backwards from that, and it sounds like nobody really enjoyed it. So if that's your conflict resolution, I mean, people are still going to watch Game of Thrones. It's built up a lot of goodwill. So, I think you can do that and get away with it. But I don't know as it's the best way to go about conflict resolution. Rather, I would encourage you to think about, the 4 steps. What do your characters want? How are they going to get it? What do your heroes want? How are they going to get it? What do your villains want? How are they going about getting it? And then how do you make those two line up to come out the way you want it to come out, to make your hero win or to make your villain win? If you're being saucy, or if it's early in the story, whichever. So yeah, conflict, how you approach it, how you sort it, very important. And it really, I would love to see more cases of people being very intentional and thinking through their characters' goals and techniques and methods as they write conflict resolution. Aim to be Doctor Strange, not Thor. Not that there's anything wrong with the first Thor movie. It was okay. I mean, you can turn your brain off and watch it and have a good time. But and really, overall writing quality, I don't know, is there a whole lot of difference between Doctor Strange and Thor, other than Wong, who is the greatest character in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Anyways, my point is, be intentional in conflict resolution, and it will be a good thing. So that's about all I got to say. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope you enjoyed looking at me laying some pencils down for a potential Hexwood cover here. And hopefully you enjoyed yourself. And if you did, leave a comment down below. Let me know what you liked. Let me know what you think of the 4 Steps to Victory as a way to think about conflict resolution in stories, not necessarily in real life. There's probably much better real life conflict resolution systems out there. Anyways, leave a comment, leave a like, or subscribe if you feel like it, and I'll talk to you later.